My name is Ibrahim Traore, and what I am about to tell you is not a story I created, but a reality I survived. There are moments in a man's life when the path before him is no longer about choice, but about calling. I have lived my life not only as a leader of a nation, but as a servant of something greater than politics, greater than power, greater than fear itself. I have always believed that leadership is not about control, but about responsibility. Responsibility for the people who cannot protect themselves. Responsibility for the voices that are silenced. And above all, responsibility to walk the path that God has placed before me, even when that path leads into darkness. Before everything happened, I was already aware of the dangers surrounding our region. The border areas near Nigeria had become places where fear lived openly. Armed groups moved like shadows. Communities were broken. Families disappeared. Entire villages lived under the constant weight of uncertainty. But I could not lead from a distance. I chose to go there myself. Not because it was safe, but because it was necessary. I traveled to those regions to meet the people, to listen to them, to understand their suffering. I wanted them to see that they were not forgotten, that even in the most dangerous corners of our land, they were still seen, still valued, still loved. Many advised against it. They told me the risks were too high. They told me I was being watched. They told me there were forces that would not hesitate to take me if given the chance. And yet, something inside me was stronger than fear. It was not courage in the way people often describe it. It was something quieter, something deeper, a conviction that I was not walking alone. In the days leading up to that journey, I began to feel something I could not fully explain. It was not fear. It was not doubt. It was a sense, a warning, almost like a whisper in the soul, a knowing. I will have to face darkness. That thought stayed with me. It followed me into my prayers. It followed me into silence. And yet, I did not turn back, because I also believe something else. That if God leads you into the valley, He does not abandon you there. So I continued forward, toward the border, toward uncertainty, toward what would become the most defining moment of my life. At that time, I did not know how far things would go. I did not know that I would be taken. I did not know that I would stand face to face with death. And I certainly did not know that what would happen next would shake even those who came to destroy me. What I am about to share is not meant to convince you. It is meant to testify. Because there are moments when the unseen becomes undeniable. Moments when the line between this world and the next disappears. And I lived through one of those moments. If you are listening closely, not just with your ears, but with your heart, then perhaps you will understand what I came to understand. That no darkness, no matter how deep, can overcome the light that comes from above. I have often been introduced as a president, a soldier, or a leader of a nation. But long before any title was placed upon my name, I was simply a man trying to understand why I had been placed on this earth. Leadership, as many people see it, is about authority. But the truth is very different. Leadership is weight. It is the quiet burden you carry when no one is watching. It is the responsibility that does not leave you even when you try to rest. And for me, it was never just political. From a young age, I believed that my life would not follow an ordinary path. Not because I desired power, but because I felt guided. There were moments in my early years when I would sit in silence, feeling as though something was shaping my steps in ways I could not yet understand. I grew up surrounded by struggle, by the realities of a continent that has seen both beauty and pain beyond measure. I saw people who worked hard but received little. I saw families who prayed through suffering. I saw communities that survived not because of systems, but because of faith. And it was in those moments that something began to take root inside me. A belief that I was not meant to stand on the sidelines, that I was meant to step forward, not for myself, but for others. As I grew older, that belief did not fade. It became stronger, more defined. I entered paths that placed me closer to responsibility, closer to decision-making, closer to the lives of people who depended on choices made far above them. And yet even then I never separated my role from my faith, because to me they were never separate. I did not believe that God exists only in places of worship. I believed He walks with us in the fields, in the streets, in the moments of fear, and in the moments of decision. So when I eventually stood in a position of leadership, I did not see it as an achievement. I saw it as an assignment that came with a cost. Because when you choose to stand for truth, you also become visible to those who stand against it. And I knew that. Even before anyone said it out loud, I understood that there would be consequences. There are forces in this world that do not operate in the light. They do not negotiate with honesty. They do not respect life, and they do not forgive those who challenge them. The regions near the border, especially toward Nigeria, had become places where these forces grew stronger. Extremist groups moved with confidence. They recruited, they destroyed, they ruled through fear. Entire communities were caught between survival and silence. And I could not accept that. Not as a leader, not as a man, not as someone who believes that every human life carries value. So I made a decision that many considered too dangerous. I would go there myself, not with a distant command, not through reports, but in person, to walk the same ground, to look into the eyes of the people, to hear their voices without filters, and to remind them that they were not abandoned. The preparations began quietly. Security teams raised concerns. Advisors questioned the necessity. Some even tried to stop the journey altogether. They told me that my presence would attract attention, that I would become a target, that there were groups already watching my movements, and they were right. But what they did not fully understand was this. I had already accepted the risk, because sometimes the mission is more important than safety. In the nights before the journey, something began to change within me, not in my plans, but in my spirit. There was a stillness that felt different, a weight in the silence, as if something unseen was drawing closer. I remember one night in particular. I sat alone, no noise, no distractions, just the quiet. And in that quiet, a thought came to me with a clarity I could not ignore. You will face darkness. It was not a voice I heard with my ears, but it was undeniable. It settled deep inside me, and for a moment, I paused, because I understood what that could mean. Darkness is not always physical. It is not just the absence of light. It is the presence of something that seeks to consume, to destroy, to end. And I knew in that moment that whatever lay ahead would not be small. But what surprised me was not fear. It was peace. A quiet, steady peace that did not come from understanding the situation, but from trusting beyond it. I did not ask to avoid what was coming. I did not ask for an easier path. Instead, I prayed for strength. Strength to stand. Strength to endure. Strength to remain faithful no matter what I would face. Because I believe something that has never left me. If God allows you to walk into darkness, it is not for your destruction. It is for a purpose you may not yet understand. And so, when the day came, I did not hesitate. I moved forward, toward the border, toward the unknown, toward a moment that would test not only my body, but my faith, my identity, and everything I believed about life and death. At that time, I was still free, still walking, still unaware of how quickly everything would change. But the shadow had already begun to move. The road toward the border was quieter than I expected. Not peaceful, but heavy. There is a difference. Peace carries calm, but this silence carried tension, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Our convoy moved steadily through stretches of dry terrain, broken by scattered vegetation and small clusters of homes that seemed almost frozen in time. People watched us pass, some with hope, others with caution. In places like this, trust does not come easily. Every kilometer forward felt like a step deeper into uncertainty. My team remained alert. Their eyes scanned everything. The road, the horizon, the movement of the wind through the trees. Because in regions like this, danger does not always announce itself. It waits, and then it appears all at once. We had been traveling for some time when something changed. At first, it was subtle. A shift in the movement ahead, vehicles slowing, a checkpoint, but something about it was wrong. It did not feel official. There were barriers, yes. Men standing guard, yes. Weapons visible. But there was no order, no structure, no markings that identified them as part of any recognized force. Just presence. Cold, controlled presence. My security detail noticed it immediately. I could feel the tension inside the vehicle rise without a word being spoken. We slowed. And in that moment, everything became very clear. This was not a checkpoint. It was a trap. Before any decision could be made, it began. Armed men moved with speed and precision. They did not hesitate. They surrounded us from all sides. Weapons raised, voices shouting commands that were not meant to be negotiated. The sound of metal striking metal, doors forced open. Chaos but controlled chaos. This was planned. Every movement was deliberate, every second calculated. My guards reacted instantly. They attempted to secure the situation, to create space, to assess whether escape was possible. When you watch and support this, but there was no space, no opening. We had already been contained. I remember the moment clearly, not because it was loud, but because inside me, everything became quiet. There are moments when time does not slow down, but your awareness sharpens. You see everything. You understand everything. And in that clarity, I knew this was the darkness I had been warned about. Hands pulled me from the vehicle, rough, unforgiving. There was no respect in their actions, only intent. I was not seen as a person. I was a target, a prize, something they had been waiting for. I did not resist, not because I was weak, but because I understood the situation. Resistance in that moment would not bring freedom. It would only bring immediate death. And I felt deep inside that this was not where my story would end. Voices surrounded me, some speaking in anger, some in excitement, some in disbelief. They knew who I was. That became clear very quickly. This was not random. They had been watching, tracking, waiting. One of them stepped closer. He looked directly into my face. There was recognition in his eyes, but not respect, only satisfaction, as if something long planned had finally been completed. I was struck hard. The world shifted, not slowly, but instantly, and then darkness. When I regained consciousness, everything had changed. The air was different, thick, damp, heavy with something that felt almost suffocating. I could not see, not clearly, only shadows, shapes. I tried to move, but my body resisted. Pain answered before movement did. Then I felt it. My hands bound, my legs restrained, cold metal against my skin, chains. I was no longer on the road. I was below it, underground. The realization came slowly, but it came with certainty. I had been taken, not just captured, removed, hidden, erased from the world above. There was no sound of vehicles, no voices of civilians, no sign of life beyond the walls that held me, only silence. And in that silence, the beginning of something far worse than the ambush itself. Because the moment of capture is not the end of fear. It is the beginning of it. I tested my strength, pulled against the restraints, but they did not move. Whoever had done this knew exactly how to secure a man, especially a man they intended to keep. Time lost its meaning quickly. I do not know how long I lay there before they returned, but when they did, the darkness shifted. The door opened somewhere above. Light entered, briefly, and with it, footsteps, slow, deliberate, approaching. I did not know what they would do, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I was no longer in control of my situation, and whatever came next would not be mercy. When the door opened, the light did not bring comfort. It revealed the truth. The space I was in was not simply a room. It was a place designed to break a man. The walls were rough, damp, and stained with time and suffering. The air was thick, almost unmoving, carrying a smell that spoke of neglect, of pain, of bodies that had been there before me and perhaps never left. I tried to adjust my eyes, but the darkness resisted. It clung to everything. Even the light that entered seemed weak, as if it too did not want to remain there for long. They stepped inside, several of them. I could hear their boots against the ground before I could fully see their faces. There was no urgency in their movement, no hesitation, only control. The kind of control that comes from knowing the person before you has nowhere to go. One of them approached me. He crouched down close enough that I could feel his breath. He studied my face, not with curiosity, but with confirmation. Then he spoke, not loudly, not angrily, but with certainty. A leader, now a prisoner. The words did not surprise me, but the weight behind them did. Because in that moment, I understood something clearly. They did not just capture me. They had been searching for me, watching me, following my movements long before that checkpoint. I was not an accident. I was their objective. Another voice followed. This one colder, more direct. You are not here by chance. We know who you are. We know what you represent. I remained silent, not out of defiance, but out of awareness. Words would not change anything in that moment. They were not there to understand me. They were there to break me. The chains around my wrists were tightened. My legs were fixed more firmly to the wall. Every movement was restricted. Even breathing felt heavier under the weight of that space. Then came the first demand. It was simple, clear, and final. You will choose. The man stood, looked down at me, and continued. You will deny your faith, or you will die. There was no negotiation in his voice, no room for delay, just a statement of what they believed would happen. For a brief moment, everything inside me became still again, not frozen, but focused, because this was not just a threat, it was a test, not of my body, but of who I truly was. Faith for many is something spoken in comfort, in safety, in places where nothing challenges it, but here, in darkness, in chains, in the presence of men who had already decided my fate, faith became something else. It became the only thing that remained. I did not answer immediately, not because I was unsure, but because I understood the weight of that moment. Every word I spoke would define what came next. The man stepped closer again, impatient, expecting fear, expecting hesitation, expecting surrender. But what I felt was not fear, it was clarity. I lifted my head as much as the chains allowed, looked toward him, and spoke quietly, not to provoke, not to challenge, but simply to state the truth. I will not deny what I believe. Silence followed, but it was not empty. It was filled with reaction. Some of them laughed, others shifted uncomfortably, and one became visibly angry. The one who had been speaking, he did not shout. He did not strike me immediately. He just stared, as if trying to understand whether I truly meant what I had said. Then he nodded, slowly, and stepped back. Then you have chosen. That was the moment everything changed. Because from that point forward, I was no longer just a prisoner. I was a condemned man. The door closed again. The light disappeared, and the darkness returned, heavier than before. But something else remained with me. Something they could not see. Something they could not chain. A quiet presence. Not loud. Not overwhelming. But steady. And in that presence I understood something I had never fully grasped until that moment. Even in the deepest darkness, you are not alone. Time passed differently after that. I could not measure it. Could not track it. Only feel it through the cycles of silence and interruption. Through the moments when they returned. Through the moments when pain followed. Because what came next was not immediate death. It was something else. Something designed to weaken not just the body, but the mind. And yet, even as the darkness deepened, so did something inside me. Something they could not break. Pain does not arrive all at once. It builds, it returns. It teaches you the limits of your body, and then forces you beyond them. When they came back, there were no more questions, no more offers, no more choices, only action. They pulled me from the wall, not to free me, but to reposition me, to prepare me. I could feel it in the way they moved. This was no longer about capturing information. It was about breaking resistance. The first blow came without warning, sharp, direct, not meant to injure permanently, but meant to begin something. Then another, and another. The body reacts before the mind can process. You feel it, you endure it, but after a while something changes. The pain is still there, but your awareness shifts. You begin to understand that what they want is not just your suffering. They want your surrender. And that is a very different thing. They used everything. Their hands, their tools, their methods, whips that cut across the skin, electric shocks that force the body to convulse against its own will, long stretches without food, without water, moments where even breathing felt like effort. And in between all of that, silence. A silence that was not peaceful, but calculated, because isolation does something that physical pain cannot. It forces a man to face himself, to question, to doubt, to wonder how long he can endure. There were times when they brought me out of the cell, not to free me, but to show me something. Other prisoners, other victims, moments of execution. They forced me to watch, to hear, to feel the finality of what awaited me. It was psychological, but it's easy. They wanted me to see the end before it came. They wanted fear to grow inside me, to weaken me from within, and yet something unexpected began to happen. Not to them, but to me. I did not fight them physically. I knew that was useless. I did not respond with anger, because anger would only feed what they wanted. Instead, I prayed. At first it was simple, short, quiet, words spoken not out loud but within, not for rescue, not for escape, but for strength. Then something changed. As the days passed, or what felt like days, my prayers became different. They were no longer only for myself. I began to pray for them, for the men who struck me, for the ones who mocked me, for the ones who believed they were justified, not because they deserved it, but because something inside me told me to. And I will be honest, it was not easy. There were moments when my body was weak, when my mind felt close to breaking, when the pain blurred everything. And in those moments, it would have been easier to hate, easier to wish for their destruction. But every time that thought came, it did not stay, because something stronger replaced it. A quiet reminder that darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. And so I continued, not perfectly, not without struggle, but consistently. I held on to that, even when I could barely stand, even when my voice could not form words, even when I felt completely alone. Because deep inside, I was not alone. There were moments I cannot fully explain, moments where the pain did not disappear, but felt distant, as if something was standing between me and it. Moments where a calm would come over me in the middle of chaos. Not natural, not logical, but real. More real than the walls around me, more real than the chains that held me. They noticed it. I could see it in their eyes. Confusion, frustration, because I was not reacting the way they expected. I was not breaking, not in the way they understood, and that unsettled them. One of them said it once, quietly, almost to himself. He should be finished by now, but I was not. Not because I was strong, but because something was holding me, something beyond my own strength, something they could not touch. And the more they pushed, the clearer it became. This was not just a battle of body against force. It was a battle of spirit against darkness. And they did not fully understand what they were facing. But I began to, because in that place where pain was constant, where death was certain, where hope should not exist, I began to feel something growing, not fear, not despair, but faith, stronger than before, deeper than before, unshaken by what surrounded me. And that is when I realized something that changed everything. They could control my body. They could control my environment. They could even control the moment of my death, but they could not control what lived inside me. And as long as that remained, I was not defeated, no matter what they did. There comes a moment when uncertainty ends, not because the situation improves, but because the outcome becomes clear. For me, that moment arrived without announcement, no warning, no explanation, just a change in the way they looked at me. When they entered the cell that day, something was different. There was no anger, no urgency, no attempt to provoke or break me further, only purpose. And I understood immediately. This was the end they had been preparing for. They removed the chains from the wall, but not to give me freedom. My hands remained bound. My strength was limited. My body weak from everything that had already been done to it. They did not speak much. They did not need to. Their actions said everything. They brought clothing, simple, plain, recognizable, the kind worn by those who were about to die. They forced me to change, not violently, but firmly, as if this was a routine, as if I was not the first, and certainly not the last. As I stood there, supported more by will than by strength, I realized something I had not allowed myself to fully accept until that moment. This could truly be my final day, not as a possibility, but as a reality. And yet, what came over me was not fear. It was something I struggle even now to describe. A calm, not the calm of ignorance, but the calm of acceptance. A peace that did not come from the situation, but from something deeper. Something that told me, you are not alone, even here. They led me out, The air outside felt different. Light was brighter than anything I had seen since my capture, and for a moment, my eyes resisted it. But I kept walking, step by step, not because I was forced, but because I had already surrendered something greater than my body. We arrived at a place that had been prepared. There was no doubt about it. This was not spontaneous. This was deliberate. A clearing, open ground, arranged in a way that made its purpose unmistakable. There were men positioned around the area, watching, waiting, some with weapons, others with devices, cameras. They were setting a scene, not just for death, but for a message. They wanted this moment recorded, shared, used. And I understood. This was not only about ending my life, it was about making an example of it. They placed me in the center, my hands still bound, my body weak, but my mind clear, more clear than it had ever been. One of them approached, the same man who had spoken to me before, the one who had given me the choice. He looked at me again, searching for something, perhaps fear, perhaps regret, perhaps a final chance to break me, but he found none of it. He spoke again. This is your last moment, you can still choose. His voice was calm, but behind it, expectation. As if he believed that at the edge of death every man changes, that fear would finally win, that survival would overcome belief. I listened, not to his words, but to what they represented. This was the final test, not of my strength, but of my truth. And in that moment, I felt something I had not expected. Gratitude, not for what was happening, but for the clarity it brought. Because when everything is stripped away, you see what truly matters. I looked at him, and I spoke again, quietly, but without hesitation. I have already chosen. There was no anger in my voice, no resistance, only certainty. He held my gaze for a moment longer, then stepped back and gave the signal. They moved quickly, efficiently. One positioned behind me, another prepared the instrument. The cameras adjusted, focused. Everything was ready. I was guided to my knees, not forced down harshly, but placed, as if this moment had been rehearsed many times before. The ground beneath me was dry, still, silent. And as I knelt there, I closed my eyes, not to escape, but to connect. I did not pray for my life to be spared. I did not ask for a miracle. I simply spoke within, your will, not mine. And in that moment, the fear that should have been there was not. Instead, there was peace, a deep, unshakable peace, the kind that does not come from this world, the kind that cannot be explained by logic or reason. Behind me, I could feel the presence of the one assigned to end my life. The movement, the preparation, the final act, everything had reached its conclusion. And then, something changed, not slowly, not gradually, but instantly, because what happened next was something none of us expected. I was on my knees, ready for the end. Everything had been prepared. The silence had settled. The final act was only a breath away. And then it broke. Not the silence, but reality itself. At first, it was not something I saw. It was something I felt. A sudden shift in the air, as if the space around me had changed. Not physically, but in a way that reached deeper than the senses. The man behind me, the one holding the blade, froze. I could hear it in the way his movement stopped mid-action, a hesitation that did not belong in a place like this. Then came a sound, not loud, but sharp. A voice, not mine, not theirs. A cry of confusion. What is that? Another voice followed, more urgent. Do you see it? The calm they had maintained shattered. I opened my eyes, slowly, carefully, expecting to see something. But what I saw was not what they saw. The men around me were no longer composed. They were no longer controlled. They were afraid. Not the kind of fear they had tried to place inside me, but a deeper fear, the kind that comes when something cannot be explained. They stepped back, one after another. Weapons lowered, eyes fixed on something beyond me, something I could not fully see. And yet, I could feel it. A presence, too strong, surrounding, unmistakable. They began to shout, not commands, not threats, but words filled with panic. Light! There is light! Warriors! Their voices were no longer unified. They were scattered, broken. Some stumbled backward. Others dropped what they were holding. One fell to the ground as if his strength had been taken from him. I remained where I was, still on my knees, still bound, but no longer in the same moment I had been in just seconds before, because what had been certain was no longer certain. The air around me felt different, not heavy, not suffocating, but filled, alive in a way I had never experienced. I could not see clearly what they were seeing, but I knew this was not ordinary. There was no source of light visible in the way they described, and yet their reactions were real. Their fear was real. Their confusion, undeniable. One of them screamed, louder than the rest. "They are here." Another voice answered, "No, this is not possible." And yet, it was happening. I felt something then, not on my skin, but within me, a strength that did not come from my body, a calm that deepened beyond anything I had felt before. It was as if something had stepped into that place, not gently, but with authority, the kind of authority that does not need to announce itself, because it is already known. The man behind me dropped the blade. I heard it hit the ground, a sound that should have been ordinary, but in that moment, it carried meaning, because it meant the act had stopped. The moment had been interrupted. Something had intervened. I did not turn. I did not move. I remained still. But everything around me was shifting. Men who had shown no hesitation before were now retreating. Some covered their eyes. Others turned away completely, as if what they were seeing was too much to bear. And in the middle of all of it, I felt it clearly. I was not alone, not in a symbolic way, not in a hopeful way, but in a real, undeniable presence. Something stood with me, around me, for me, and it was stronger than everything that had been placed against me. Time seemed to stretch. Moments felt longer than they should. The chaos continued, voices rising, falling, breaking. Then silence began to return. Not the silence from before, but a different kind. A silence after something has passed, after something has changed everything. When I finally looked up, the men were no longer the same. They stood at a distance, some shaken, some unable to speak, some staring at me, not with anger, but with something else. Fear, not of me, but of what had just happened. One of them whispered, softly, almost as if he did not want to say it out loud, "This is not of this world." And for the first time since my capture, the ones who held power did not look in control, because whatever they had seen, whatever had stepped into that moment, had taken that control away. And I knew, without needing to see everything they saw, that this was not the end. This was the beginning of something none of us could have imagined. The silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy with what had just happened. No one moved at first, not with purpose, not with certainty. The same men who had stood with control only moments before were now uncertain, as if something inside them had been shaken loose. I slowly became aware of something else. My hands, the pressure that had held them bound, was no longer the same. I shifted slightly, carefully, expecting resistance, but instead, there was movement. The restraints had loosened, not by force, not by struggle, but as if they had simply given way. I pulled again, and this time they fell. The rope dropped to the ground, soft, almost unnoticed in the vast silence around us. But to me, it was undeniable. I was no longer bound. I did not rush to stand. I did not react with sudden movement, because I understood something deeply in that moment. This was not a moment to act out of instinct. This was a moment to recognize what had just taken place. The men saw it too. Their eyes followed the movement of the rope. Some stepped back further, as if distance could protect them from what they did not understand. One of them spoke. His voice was unsteady. "How?" Another answered, but not with certainty. "We did not untie him." Their words revealed more than they intended, because they were no longer speaking as captors. They were speaking as witnesses. Witnesses to something that had disrupted everything they believed they controlled. I slowly rose to my feet, my body still weak, still marked by everything I had endured, but something within me had changed. Not physically, but deeply. I was not standing in defiance. I was standing in awareness, because I knew this moment did not belong to me. It belonged to something far greater. The man who had been in command stepped forward, slowly, cautiously. His movements no longer carried authority. They carried hesitation. He looked at me, not with anger, not with dominance, but with something I had not seen in him before, fear and recognition. He opened his mouth to speak, but for a moment, no words came. Then finally, quietly, he said, "What we saw was real." It was not a question. It was a confession. He continued, his voice low, almost as if he did not want the others to hear fully. There was light, but no source. He paused. His eyes shifted slightly as if recalling something he did not want to remember. And figures, not like men. The others remained silent. No one laughed. No one dismissed his words, because they had seen it too. Each in their own way. Each affected. Each changed. One of them dropped to his knees, not in submission to me, but as if his strength had left him. Another covered his face, whispering words I could not fully hear, but I understood their meaning. Confusion, fear, something breaking inside them. I stood there, free, but not because I had freed myself. And in that moment I did not feel victory. I felt something else, a deep awareness that what had happened was not meant to elevate me, but to reveal something to them, because the fear in their eyes was not directed at me. It was directed at what they had encountered, the unseen made visible, the unknown made undeniable. The commander looked at me again, longer this time, studying, searching. Then he spoke words I will never forget. "We came to end your life." He stopped. His voice faltered slightly, but something else stood in our way. He did not say someone. He did not try to define it, because he could not, and neither could I. But we both understood. This was beyond us. He stepped back, not in retreat, but in acknowledgement. Something had shifted, not only in the situation, but in them, and I could see it. Not clearly, not completely, but enough to know that this was not over. Because when a man encounters something he cannot explain, he does not return unchanged. And these men were no longer the same men who had taken me. What happened in that place did not end with fear. Fear is often the beginning, not the conclusion. In the hours that followed, something began to unfold that I could not have imagined, even in my strongest faith. The men who had once surrounded me with violence were now distant, not physically alone, but separated by something invisible. Their voices were quieter, their movements slower. The certainty they once carried had been replaced with hesitation. And in that hesitation, space was created. Space for something new. At first, it showed itself in small ways. A glance that lingered too long. A hand that no longer struck. A silence where there once would have been commands. They did not release me immediately, but they no longer treated me as they had before. And I could see it. Something inside them had been disturbed. Not just their minds, but their beliefs. That night, as I remained in the place where they kept me, I noticed something unusual. They stayed closer than before, not to guard me, but as if they themselves were unsettled, as if they did not want to be alone. I heard whispers, uncertain, fragments of conversations carried through the darkness. I saw it. It was not human. Did you feel it? These were not the words of men in control. These were the words of men searching for understanding, searching for something to hold on to, and yet they had no explanation. The commander returned, but he did not come with force. He came alone. He stood at a distance for a moment before speaking, not as a man giving orders, but as a man asking a question he did not fully understand. What is it that protects you? His voice was steady, but behind it was something deeper. Not curiosity alone, but concern. I looked at him, and for the first time since my capture, I did not see an enemy. I saw a man who had encountered something that challenged everything he believed. And I answered him simply, "It is not something, it is someone." He did not interrupt. He did not react immediately. So I continued, "The one I serve does not abandon those who trust him, even in darkness." The words were not meant to convince him. They were meant to explain what I had lived. He lowered his gaze slightly, not in submission, but in thought, as if something inside him was trying to connect what he had seen with what I had said. Then he spoke again. Some of the men, they cannot sleep. I remained silent, allowing him to continue. They say they see it again when they close their eyes. He paused, his voice softer now. They hear something calling. That was when I understood. What they had experienced had not ended in that moment. It had followed them into their thoughts, into their rest, into the places where a man cannot hide from himself. Days passed, or what felt like days. Time was no longer something I could measure clearly, but I could see change. One of the men who had once struck me refused to come near. Another began to bring water without being told, not openly, not in a way that would be noticed by all, but quietly, as if he himself did not fully understand why. Then, one night, something happened. A man entered the space where I was kept, alone. His hands trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from something deeper. He knelt, not before me, but near me, and he spoke. I saw it again. His voice was barely above a whisper. In my dream, the light and those figures. He paused, his breathing uneven. They were not angry. That detail stayed with me, because it meant something had changed, not just in what he saw, but in how he understood it. He continued. They were watching. He looked up at me, not with fear this time, but with something closer to longing. What does it mean? That question was no longer about what had happened. It was about what it revealed. I answered him the only way I could. It means you were given a chance to see what most people never see. He did not respond immediately, but I could see it. Something inside him was shifting. Not completely, not instantly, but undeniably. Others followed. Not all at once, not openly, but one by one. Conversations that were once impossible began to happen. Not about politics, not about power, but about meaning, about truth, about what lies beyond what we can see. Some of them began to confess things they had done, things they carried, not because I asked, but because something inside them was being exposed. And in that exposure, there was pain, but also the beginning of something else. The commander returned again, this time different. He did not stand at a distance. He came closer, not as a threat, but as someone who had made a decision. He looked at me directly and said, "This cannot continue." He did not explain immediately, but I understood. Something had reached its turning point. Because once a man begins to question, he cannot return to blind certainty. And these men were no longer the same men who had captured me. They had seen something, felt something, experienced something that would not let them go back. And that is when I realized the miracle was not only that I had been spared, it was that hearts had begun to change. When the commander said, "This cannot continue," I understood that something irreversible had already begun. But I did not yet know how far he was willing to go. In places like that, decisions are not simple. They are dangerous. Because every choice carries consequences, not just for one man, but for many. He did not speak immediately after those words. Instead, he looked around, as if measuring the weight of what he was about to do. Then he stepped closer, lowered his voice, and said something I never expected to hear from the man who had once ordered my death. "We are going to get you out." For a moment, I remained silent, not because I doubted him, but because I understood what that meant. This was not just an act of mercy. It was an act of defiance against his own men, against the structure he had been part of, against everything that had brought him to that place. And such a decision does not come without risk. "Why?" I asked quietly. He paused, not searching for words, but choosing them carefully. Because what we saw was not meant to be ignored. He looked directly at me, and if we continue after that, then we are no longer men. There was no emotion in his voice, but there was conviction. A conviction born not from argument, but from encounter. He began to explain the plan. Not in detail at first, but enough for me to understand the path ahead. There would be no large movement, no sudden escape, no visible break. Everything would be quiet, controlled, hidden within normal routine. A path created step by step. He had already chosen a few men, not all, only those who had been most affected, those who had seen, those who had not been able to return to their previous state. They would help, but carefully, because if the others discovered the truth, none of us would leave that place alive. The first step was simple: change my status. Not openly, but internally, I would no longer be treated as a condemned prisoner, but as someone awaiting transfer. It would not raise suspicion immediately, but it would create movement. Movement creates opportunity. The next step was timing. There were moments when oversight was weaker, when attention shifted, when control loosened just enough. Those moments would be used, not rushed, not forced, but taken when they appeared. Days passed as the plan formed, and during those days I saw something that stayed with me. The men who had chosen to help me were not the same. They moved differently, spoke differently. Even their eyes carried something new. Not fear, but awareness, as if they had seen beyond the life they once accepted. One of them spoke to me quietly. "We cannot go back after this." I understood what he meant. Helping me was not just an action. It was a crossing. A line that once passed cannot be undone. The night of the escape did not feel dramatic. There was no sudden signal, no rush of movement. It began like any other moment, quiet, still. But beneath that stillness, everything was in motion. They came for me, not with force, but with purpose. My restraints were removed completely this time, not loosened, not hidden, gone. They gave me clothing, different from before, blending, unremarkable, the kind that would not draw attention. We moved through the compound slowly, carefully, each step measured, each turn chosen. There were checkpoints, not the kind I had encountered before, but internal ones, places where questions could be asked, where suspicion could rise. And every time the commander led, his presence still carried authority, enough to pass without challenge, but I could feel the tension in him, in the others, because one mistake, one wrong look, one moment of hesitation would end everything. We passed one checkpoint, then another, each one narrowing the distance between captivity and freedom, but also increasing the risk. At one point, a guard looked directly at me, longer than expected. I felt the moment stretch, time slowing just enough to make everything feel uncertain. But then, he looked away, and we continued. The final boundary approached, not marked clearly, but understood. Beyond it was the outside, not safety, but possibility. And in that moment, the commander stopped, turned to me, and said quietly, "From here, you must go." There was no ceremony, no final speech, just a decision made real. I looked at him, not as a man who had once captured me, but as a man who had chosen differently. "You are coming with me," I said. He shook his head slightly. "I cannot." But then he paused and added, "Not yet." Behind him, two others stepped forward. The ones who had changed the most, the ones who had spoken, the ones who had struggled with what they had seen. "We will go," one of them said, not as a request, but as a decision. The commander looked at them, and for a moment, something passed between them. Understanding, agreement, finality. Then he stepped back, creating space, not just physically, but symbolically. And with that, we crossed out of the place that had held me, into the unknown. The journey was not over. In many ways, it had just begun, because leaving that place did not mean safety. It meant movement, through land still controlled, through checkpoints not prepared for us, through moments where discovery was still possible. We traveled carefully, avoiding main paths, using knowledge only they possessed. Every sound mattered, every shadow mattered, every step carried risk. But step by step, distance grew. And with that distance, hope, not loud, not overwhelming, but present. And then, at a point I can only describe as the edge between danger and escape, we made it through. No alarms, no pursuit, no interruption, just silence. The kind of silence that comes when something impossible has just happened. I stood there, Free, not because I had fought my way out. Free, not because I had fought my way out, but because something far greater had moved through that entire situation, and I was not alone. The men who had once stood against me now stood beside me. Changed, not completely, not perfectly, but undeniably. And in that moment, I understood something I will never forget. Sometimes the greatest rescue is not just from danger, but from who we once were. Freedom does not always feel the way people imagine it. When I finally reached a place where I was no longer in immediate danger, there was no celebration, no moment of release where everything suddenly became light. Instead, there was silence. A silence filled with everything that had happened. My body was weak, my strength not yet returned, but my mind was carrying something far heavier, because I knew that what I had experienced would not be easily understood. We moved carefully after escaping, avoiding attention, keeping distance from any place that could draw questions too quickly. The men who had come with me stayed close, not as guards, but as companions. They did not speak much at first, and I understood why. They were no longer who they had been, but they were not yet fully something else. They were in between, and that place is not easy to stand in. Eventually, we reached people who could help, those who recognized me, those who had been searching, those who had begun to believe that I was already gone. When they saw me, their reactions were immediate. Shock, relief, disbelief, because from everything they had heard, from everything they had assumed, I should not have been standing there. Questions came quickly. Where had I been? What had happened? How did I survive? And for a moment, I did not answer. Not because I could not, but because I knew that words alone would not carry the weight of what I had lived. When I finally began to speak, I told them the truth, not exaggerated, not softened, simply as it happened. The capture, the darkness, the torture, the execution that never came. The moment everything changed. And as I spoke, I could see it. The hesitation in their eyes, not rejection, but difficulty, because what I described did not fit within what they understood. Some listened with deep attention, others with quiet doubt, not spoken out loud, but present. Because the world teaches us to accept what can be explained and to question what cannot. But then something shifted, not because of my words, but because of those who stood beside me, the men who had once been my captors. They did not hide. They did not remain silent. One of them stepped forward, not as someone defending me, but as someone testifying to what he himself had seen. He spoke, slowly, carefully, but with certainty. We were there. The room grew still. He continued. We prepared to kill him. No one interrupted. No one moved. Because now, the story was no longer coming from one voice. It should have happened, he said, but it did not. Another stepped forward, his voice less steady, but just as real. There was light. He paused, struggling to describe what could not easily be described. No source, but it was everywhere. The others listened, not with skepticism now, but with something closer to unease, because these were not men trying to impress. They were men who had nothing to gain from speaking, only something to risk. One of them said something that stayed with everyone in that room. We were not stopped by force. He looked down briefly, then back up. We were stopped by something we could not stand against. Silence followed. Not empty silence, but the kind that comes when something has reached beyond explanation. Because now, it was no longer one account. It was many, from different voices, different perspectives, all pointing to the same moment. And that changed everything. The doubt did not disappear completely. It never does. But it shifted from rejection to questioning, from dismissal to consideration. And from that point on, the story began to move, not through announcement, not through force, but through people, through conversations, through those who had heard, through those who had seen. It spread quietly at first, then wider, crossing places, crossing boundaries, reaching those who were searching for something, even if they did not know what. Some believed immediately, others took time, and some chose not to believe at all. And that is the nature of truth. It does not force itself. It reveals itself and allows each person to respond. But what could not be denied was change. The men who had come with me did not return to who they were. They did not go back. They chose a different path. Not perfectly, not without struggle, but intentionally. Because once you have seen something beyond your understanding, you cannot fully return to ignorance. And as I watched them, as I listened to their words, as I saw the impact of what had happened, I understood something more clearly than ever before. This was never only about my survival. It was about transformation, not just of one man, but of many, and perhaps of those who would hear this story long after it was told. Because the question is not only what happened, the question is, what will you do with it? There are moments in life that divide everything into before and after. What I lived through became that moment for me, not because I faced death, but because I encountered something that revealed life in a way I had never fully understood before. When I returned, the world around me had not changed. The same conflicts existed. The same struggles continued. The same questions remained unanswered. But I was no longer the same. Because when you stand at the edge of death and discover that you are not alone, everything you once feared begins to lose its power. I do not share this story to make myself appear strong, because I was not strong. My body failed. My strength was limited. There were moments when I could barely endure what was happening to me. But what carried me through was not my own ability. It was something greater, something that does not leave when everything else is taken away, something that does not fade in darkness. Something that does not break under pressure. Faith, not as a word, but as a reality, a living, active presence. There are many who will hear this and question it, and I understand that, because there was a time when I might have struggled to understand it as well. But I do not ask you to believe because I say it. I ask you to reflect, because something in your own life has likely already shown you that there are moments that cannot be explained, moments when help arrives without warning, moments when strength appears when you have none left. Moments when you are carried, even when you feel like you cannot move forward. What I experienced was not meant only for me. It was meant to remind that no matter how deep the darkness becomes, it does not have the final word. I stood in a place where death was certain, where men had decided my fate, where everything pointed to an ending. And yet, that was not the end. Because there is a power greater than the decisions of men. There is a presence that does not ask for permission to act. And when it moves, everything changes. But perhaps the greatest miracle was not that I lived. It was that hearts were changed. Men who once carried violence began to question. Men who once believed in destruction began to search for something different. Men who once stood against life chose to walk toward it. And that is something no force on earth can truly explain. We often believe that change must come through pressure, through conflict, through control. But what I saw was change that came through encounter, through revelation, through something that reached beyond fear and touched the core of who they were. That is why I say this with complete certainty. No one is beyond redemption. No one is too far gone. No darkness is too deep. Because I have seen men who stood in darkness turn toward the light, not because they were forced, but because they saw something that made them choose differently. And now, I speak to you, not as a leader, not as a president, but as a man who has stood where life ends and returned. If you are carrying something heavy, if you feel surrounded by darkness, if you believe that there is no way forward, I want you to remember this. You are not alone, even when it feels like it, even when everything around you says otherwise, even when the situation seems final. There is still something greater at work. And sometimes it reveals itself when you least expect it. Not always in the way you imagine, not always in a way you can explain, but always in a way that matters. I have walked through darkness. I have stood before death. And I have lived to speak of what I witnessed, not as a story, but as truth. And if this message reaches you, then perhaps it was meant to, not to convince you, but to remind you that light still exists, that hope is not lost, and that even in the most impossible moments, something greater can intervene. So choose carefully how you live. Choose what you hold on to. Choose what you believe. Because those choices matter more than you realize, not only for you, but for those around you. And if you have ever wondered whether change is possible, whether redemption is real, whether darkness can truly be overcome, then let this be my answer. It is possible. I have seen it. I have lived it. And I stand here because of it. If this story has touched something within you, do not ignore it. Reflect on it. Carry it with you. And if you feel led, share your thoughts. Not for me, but for yourself. Because sometimes speaking what is in your heart is the first step toward understanding it. And if you wish to hear more, to continue exploring stories that reveal what is often unseen, you are welcome to return, not out of obligation, but out of desire to seek what is true. Because truth does not hide forever. It waits to be discovered. I am Ibrahim Traore, President of Burkina Faso, and what I have spoken is truth witnessed in the face of death. I am Ibrahim Traore, President of Burkina Faso, and these words are not a story, but a testimony of what I have lived. I am Ibrahim Traore, President of Burkina Faso, and I stand as proof that even in darkness the light remains.